Hello everyone, and welcome to our 6th video in our online learning experience. This is going to be video number 1 of our new mini-series on comparative poetry. I'm going to begin by explaining in the video what is comparative poetry, what sort of steps do we need to take in order to complete it, and then we'll continue with looking at our first poem in this series, Piano by D.H. Lawrence. So when I look into comparative poetry, it simply means that I'm taking 2 or more poems and I'm comparing them, trying to see what sort of similarities and differences exist in terms not just of topic and theme, but how the poet chooses to give their perspective on those 2 things. And the first thing that I want to make sure that I do is look at the poet's background. This is something, by the way, that you are encouraged to do when you're completing your poetry portfolio assignment. So if you're unclear about how to go about gathering this type of information, this slide in particular will be helpful to you. So the first thing I do then in terms of the poet's background is I ask myself a few questions. So one, what sort of context did they live in? Meaning, what was their geographic location and what period of history were they born in? You'll see I've included a picture of our first poet, D.H. Lawrence, on the right. And I've given you his geographic location as well as the time period that he grew up in. So he's an English poet, not meaning that he wrote in the English language, although he did, but that he is from England. And he lived specifically from the time of 1885 to 1930. So I then need to ask myself and recall my history lessons, what sort of things were going on historically at this time. So one huge thing that should come to mind is World War I. Additionally, I should think about the Industrial Revolution, this idea that machines are now becoming popular and taking over roles that humans used to fulfill. Then I'm going to take this information and ask myself an additional 2 questions. So one in particular, what did this poet typically write about? And what about their past might explain for me why they wrote about what they did? And for D.H. Lawrence, the things that he typically wrote about were the negative impacts that this modernization and this movement to a more industrialized society had, in his opinion. And we see that he's very wary, in some sense, of the future of humanity where that's concerned. But also, it impacts what he chooses to write about in terms of his past. So we see that he has a strong connection with his mother, a very good relationship with her. This is something we need to remember as we begin to analyze his first poem, Piano, but also that his work was heavily criticized. So he wasn't someone who was praised openly by a majority of people during his lifetime. In fact, many people looked at the topics he chose to write about and condemned him for it, specifically topics relating to human emotion and experience, both the good, the bad, and the ugly that comes with that. The next step in comparative poetry then is actually reading and annotating the poems. So the first thing I do is I read through it once for comprehension, and I ask myself, have I understood the topic that the speaker is discussing, and are there certain words that I need to look up? Because unless I understand these 2 things, analyzing the poem is going to be near to impossible. Then I'm going to read through the poem again, as many times as it takes for me to thoroughly analyze not just what the speaker is saying, but how they are saying it. So looking at what sort of literary devices they use, why I see them using these particular literary devices, how perhaps do they point to the theme of the poem. And you'll see in this image on the right that I've given you an example of someone who has annotated the poem for themselves. So your poem, as you analyze, either electronically or on paper, should look like this. So you should be marking up words and phrases, telling me what sort of literary devices you see, and giving all of your comments down on paper, because this is going to be helpful as you jump back to finally comparing both of those poems side by side. Then I jump to my third and final step in comparing my poems. And this is something that I get to after I have already analyzed the background of my poet and the poem itself for both of the poems I'm discussing. And I'm going to consider both poems in terms of their similarities and their differences. So first, I'm going to compare my notes and annotation on each poem. Do I see certain similar themes or topics emerging? Are there similarities in terms of how they communicate this topic? Perhaps do they both share a positive perspective on this topic? Or maybe, more interestingly, one shares a positive perspective while the other shares a negative perspective. And then I determine what is significant then about these similarities and differences. I've gone to the trouble to identify them, but now I need to ask myself and evaluate, do I believe one perspective is better than the other, or more true than the other? Which perspective do I personally side with? And do I think that there's a broader lesson to be learned in comparing both of these approaches? And you'll see off to the right, I've given you a foreshadowing of what piano is going to discuss, as well as the poem we're going to compare it to, Those Winter Sundays. And here the poets are going to be going down memory lane, so diving into their past and getting rather nostalgic in the way that they view their former days. So now that I've given you an overview of how we're going to approach comparing poetry, let's get started then with reading through our first poem, poem number 1, Piano by D.H. Lawrence. Softly, in the dusk, a woman is singing to me, taking me back down the vista of years, till I see a child sitting under the piano, in the boom of the tingling strings, and pressing the small, poised feet of a mother who smiles as she sings. In spite of myself, the insidious mastery of song betrays me back, till the heart of me weeps to belong to the old Sunday evenings at home, with winter outside and hymns in the cozy parlor, the tinkling piano our guide. So now it is vain for the singer to burst into clamor with the great black piano appassionato. The glamour of childish days is upon me. My manhood is cast down in the flood of remembrance. I weep like a child for the past. My first step then I've already completed. So I've read through it, and now I want to make sure, do I understand, do I comprehend what Lawrence is saying, what my speaker is saying? I'm going to do that by going through each stanza and trying to summarize the general idea that he's trying to get across. So I'm looking then at stanza 1, and here I know that the speaker is brought back to his childhood when he hears some woman singing, and that this childhood for him revolved around listening to his mother play the piano. And as I read through that, there's this one word that seemed rather new, vista. And so in your textbook, you're actually given the definition of this. So I encourage you, as you're reading along, make sure you make use of your textbook, because it's going to identify those key words you have to know. And vista simply means a passage affording a distant view. Then I'm going to jump to my second stanza. And here I see that this song brings him straight back to his childhood, this moment of watching his mother play the piano. But I see that he's going to recall these memories now as sadness. And one of the key words that helps me identify that is this word insidious, meaning treacherous or working subtly. Dive then to my third and final stanza. My speaker is now back in the present, but he still feels very much immersed in his past, and that there's this continued sadness and even longing to have his childhood back. And one of the key words I see there is appassionato, and this is an Italian word simply meaning with deep emotion. For those of you who are musicians, this is oftentimes a musical direction that you'll see, right? Trying to deepen your quality of sound to sort of try to display that similar emotion. Now that I have fully comprehended what the poem is saying on its surface, I then need to go back and read for analysis. And this is going to be a similar process. I'm still going to go stanza by stanza, but now it's not enough just to understand what the poem is saying, but how the poem is saying it. So I'm looking at my first stanza here, and you'll see that I've numbered these literary devices for you within the box, so numbers 1 through 7. And I'm going to start to underline different words or phrases that I see, and I'm going to underline them in that same order. So this first underlining you see for softly is going to correspond then to bullet point number 1, imagery. And the image that I see here is one of my speaker. He's out in this time of dusk, So as the sun is setting, and all of a sudden he hears this woman singing to him. And so in my mind, I'm also going to place myself there. I'm going to be walking down this street. The sun is setting. I hear a woman singing softly, pleasantly. And all of a sudden, I'm dragged back into the past. And this past I see is characterized as one that's very sweet. I get this image, right, of the speaker as a child sitting under a piano with all of this beautiful, glorious sound going on around him, and he's sitting at the feet of his mother. So an image that's very sweet and comforting. Then the next thing I'm going to do is pick up on those instances of sibilants. So again, trying to listen for those hiss or hush sounds. And here, I see the hissing sound being displayed more often, is singing, smiles as she sings, right? So again, remember we talked about sibilants, and specifically this hiss sibilants as something that should put me ill at ease. And this is going to come back into play when I discuss tone in a moment. The next thing I do is, as I'm reading, I notice that there's a metaphor being used, this vista of years. So recall that this vista is simply meaning a passage where I can see far down into the distance. But rather than this being a physical distance in terms of space, this is a distance in terms of time. So it's as if my speaker is getting dragged through this portal, this time machine back to when he was a child. So a metaphor for this nostalgic feeling that he has. The next thing that I pick up on, point number 4, is symbolism. And I see this symbol used throughout all 3 stanzas, and that's the piano itself. And the piano is going to symbolize his childhood. And I know that because the piano is not mentioned with the woman singing first, but is mentioned first when I'm dragged back into the childhood of my speaker. The next thing I notice is a sound device that you should be familiar with. I'm going to briefly go through the definition again here, simply because we haven't covered it in class yet. But that is onomatopoeia. You'll find that in your Literary Device 101 packet. An onomatopoeia is a sound device where the way that the word sounds mimics the actual sound being called to. So for example, when I say the word boom, automatically you get that same sound in your head, and you're going to associate that with other things that cause this boom. Maybe, for example, dropping your textbook on the floor. I would say that it made a boom as it crashed, and you can hear that sound in your mind as I say those words. And the very last thing I'm going to get to then before I jump to my second stanza is talking about the tone and then the mood. Remember, tone is the attitude that the speaker reveals about his subject. And here I get a sense of an attitude that is nostalgic, but also in a sense sad. Remember, now I'm recalling that use of sibilants. So I have this tension created in that hissing sound that's repeated, right? But also it's contrasted with this clearly positive way that he views his childhood, this image that I have of a child sitting at the foot or feet of his mother. And this tone, in turn, is going to impact my mood. Mood being how I, the reader, feel about what I'm being told about. And so, again, we see the same things that impact tone now impacting mood. So the speaker wants me to feel that sense of tension with them, but also I begin to feel with them this nostalgia for their past because of the imagery used. He's going to describe his childhood in such a way that I feel like I'm there myself. Jumping then to my second stanza. Again, I'm going to start with that first point, imagery. And I see a few things here that are bringing out the image created from his childhood. So first, he goes back here in spite of himself. So he doesn't want to be dragged back into his childhood, but he has no choice because the sound of the piano pulls him back there, right? Remember, the piano as a symbol for his childhood. And we also begin to see that this childhood is one that's very warm, right? He says that he hears these hymns in a cozy parlor, which is contrasted with the winter going on outside. So while the weather is cold and perhaps dark and damp, inside his home, they're singing these hymns or songs of praise to God, and they're with one another in this cozy parlor, or you can think of it as the salon that you guys would have in your homes. The next thing I jump to then is personification. And I see that here when I have the insidious mastery of song. So song is being personified here in the fact that it's capable of being treacherous or subtle in pulling my speaker back to his childhood. I also see this here with the heart of me weeps. So weeping is something like being treacherous. That's a human characteristic. And it's attributed now to the heart, right? This feeling that his innermost being is crying with the longing to have these moments back again. The next thing I see is the sound device alliteration, betrays me back. And alliteration is important because it gives this upbeat sense to the poem, much like you would have rhyming, for example, in nursery rhymes. The beat that's created through that rhyme and the beat here that's created through the use of alliteration gives me a sense of peace or this upbeat feel. I also see another example of onomatopoeia, this tinkling of the piano, so that light, bright, high-pitched sound. Again, this is going to be important when we jump back to tone and mood. The last thing, again, we have is this symbolism. Again, referencing that the piano represents for our speaker his childhood. And before we go then to the third stanza, I want to reiterate the tone and the mood here in stanza 2. And it's important to do so because we see this tone and mood shift. So in the first stanza, you have this quasi-happy tone and mood, but quasi meaning partly in the sense that our speaker is still somewhat in the first stanza in the present. So he can't fully be immersed into his past yet. But in stanza number 2, he is completely and entirely in his childhood, in spite of himself, right? So his tone and therefore the mood that we feel in the poem automatically are uplifted. We feel the happy, joyous nature of the childhood that he shared. Then finally, I come to my last stanza. And here, the imagery that I have is this sense that he is fully in his childhood. And even though we're coming back to the present, right? So now it is vain. He cannot escape the magical quality that remembering his childhood has given him. This word glamour indicates that for us. Glamour meaning something that has a magical or enchanted quality. So although he doesn't want to remember his past because it's too painful, he finds himself there nonetheless. Additionally, this symbol of the piano is repeated. Now we have it combined with this word appassionato, right? So the piano that represents his childhood is now firmly with him in the present. We understand that because, note, in the first stanza, the woman begins to sing, and the piano is not present until our speaker is fully in his childhood. Now jumping to stanza 3, we see the piano reappears, but he's no longer in the past, supposedly. He should be in the present because he's listening to that woman sing, but the piano has come with him, meaning that his childhood, he can't shake it. The remembrance of it is with him. I jump then to the use of metaphor, and I see 2 being used here. The fact that he is caught in his childhood does 2 things. It says it casts his manhood down, meaning that his adulthood, his sense of being a man and powerful and strong, he throws it aside. And it's thrown aside because of this flood of remembrance. And this flood of remembrance simply being a metaphor for his memories of his childhood. So his childhood fully takes away any sort of sense of stability or strength that he has gained as an adult. And as a result, we see this in the simile. The author explains, the speaker explains for us what that's like. And it's like a child, right? He's weeping as a young child would. But now instead of weeping, for example, because of hurt feelings or because of something that he wants in the moment, he's weeping for a past that he longs for, but that he ultimately knows he cannot have back. And this is where we come to the tone and the mood again. We see it's been sort of like a roller coaster. In stanza 1, our tone and our mood start to pick up slowly but surely. And in stanza 2, they're at their highest peak. They're joyful in remembering this childhood he has. But now in stanza 3, we see that they've finally come down. And this is going to be important in understanding the theme of the poem, because he ends in recalling these nostalgic moments with sadness. So then, after I have thoroughly analyzed my poem, I'm going to turn to my analytical takeaways and make sure that I can pull out these key ideas, because if I can, then I know that I've properly annotated and analyzed my poem, and I can then move on to my second. So the first thing I pull out is this topic. So I know very clearly he is talking about memories of his childhood, and that he has a sense of nostalgia, so wanting to have those days back. I then look at the way he utilizes literary devices, which ones he uses, what sort of impact they have on the tone and the mood of the poem, and I can then understand that although he is talking about his childhood, the tone and mood indicate to me that there is some sense of sadness in recalling this. So I can pull out one theme being this irreplaceable nature of childhood, right? This perhaps might be easier to understand if you compare your childhood now with your childhood from perhaps 10 years ago. There are things that you were able to do then that you can't do now, and you look back on those days and you long for them and you wish you could have them back. Another theme that I might derive from the poem is this idea that we should appreciate the moment we're living in while we still can, because 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we can't have those experiences back, only the memory of them. Then just again a reminder of what sort of literary devices I'm looking at. So one, the rhyme scheme that's created. I do see that I have this rhyme scheme, and it helps to give this light and airy feel to the poem. I've also identified alliteration, sibilants, and finally onomatopoeia, and how all of these help to impact the tone and mood of my poem. The last set of literary devices I see are, for example, imagery. Throughout the poem, I get a clear understanding of the man's childhood through the use of personification, symbolism, simile, and metaphor. All of these literary devices help me to understand what sort of tone and mood is used throughout the poem, right? A tone that shifts, that first begins relaxed and joyful, but then becomes rather nostalgic and sad at the realization that his childhood is gone. And as this tone shifts, I realize my mood as the reader shifts along with it. So you're going to see that you have some follow-up questions on page 229. I would like you to answer those. You can either type them or place them in your copybook. I won't collect them. This is just for you to be able to assess for yourself or evaluate whether or not you fully understood the poem and the analysis. And this is going to be important, because unless this is firmly clear in your mind, comparing it to our next poem is going to be rather a vain pursuit. That's it for video number 6. In the next video, we're going to do the same analysis process, but now with Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden, which is also in your textbook. So please make sure when you get to watching video 7 that you download the worksheet first, and that'll help you better analyze as we go along. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.